Oh, cool. Okay, I think it's going to work. I set the YouTube live stream to be unlisted, Christina.
Okay.
So that way, literally, no one will see this until we put it in there, and that way we can do the production on the WordPress side um, right now. So
Okay.
I'll be able to just go ahead and drop that in.
Okay.
Okay, it is working. So here is.
I don't know if that's a good call if he got up and walked away.
I know. So one thing that I'm going to have you help me remember, Christina, is
Okay.
at the end of this, when the YouTube live stream, it'll convert to the recording. Everything we're saying and doing right now is technically going to be part of the stream. So we need to get into the YouTube channel and edit it to trim off the front. How you doing?
He is in an Uber
Okay.
from his fundraiser in Atlanta to his hotel, and he's slated to get to the hotel right at 8. So I said, I'll just kind of vamp at the beginning. They were like, do you want him to join via phone? I was like, no, we'll just I don't know. They tried yesterday to push it back 30 minutes, and I just said no. So.
Okay. So technically what we're doing, right, we are live streaming in an unlisted YouTube right now. No one can see it unless they have the link. But this is something I had Christina remind me, but I'm gonna have you remind me too. As soon as we're done and we end this, I can go into the YouTube and trim the whole first part off. But this way now I can produce the live stream and we can go.
Well, why don't we do this at 5:58? We'll just start the Zoom. Do we have
with everybody? I don't have a graphic yet. I didn't really put one together for this, but I can if we need to. But the problem with doing it that way too is that we, when he jumps on, we need to, talk to him and get him going and everything.
So do you want to wait until he gets on the call to go? I mean, I think he can just join and we'll.
Yeah, if that's cool with everybody, then we'll basically just get going right at 6 is when we'll actually start the webinar, give him, and maybe even just a touch after.
Yeah.
And then when he joins, he can join. Are you good vamping by yourself, or should we put up a graphic? How long do you think it's actually going to take him? Because I mean, if he gets there at 8 and
check in
and has to get into his room and everything.
I don't know if he's already checked in. Can you gen up a graphic? I mean,
yeah, I can just take the one that we put up on the. We can just put a photo of his real quick. Let me see if I can do that.
Sorry.
That's okay.
We have a minute thanking everyone for sending in questions. I know a bunch came in 10 minutes ago.
Yeah, I've kind of got it all in there. I just
one of the other things that happened, and this is a thing for us to think about, Christina, is I had somehow the email reminders that went out in Eventbrite had my email address instead of questions@coloradosun.com. So the reason it looked like a lot of them came in all at once is I realized that they were all there. And so I forwarded a bunch of them to questions. So we just have to make sure that questions is the right email address. Okay, so we'll just do a really super fast graphic to kind of hang in there. And then let's just decide via Slack, basically, as you're hearing people, when we want to get in and when we want to start talking to the audience.
Okay.
So we got 3 minutes countdown until 6. I won't actually start the webinar until a little bit after that. Could be okay.
Okay, he's already checked into the hotel.
That's good. So whoever's joining seems to be having trouble getting connected to audio. Do you see that?
Yeah.
Is that who you're talking to?
Caitlin.
It looks like they got connected. Okay.
Great. So yeah, like we were saying before, Christina, this is where I'm going to do the hide non-video participants, and we'll have the view following my view. And I think for now, we'll go ahead and just set it to be speaker. All right, we're getting close. All right, I will have my graphic here, and so I will be sharing my screen. So Christina, go ahead and turn your video off. And then, okay, so as long as it sounds like if he's there, great. Okay, so Jesse, I'm going to share my screen. It's just going to be my graphic. I'm going to stay mute. And then I'll count you in on Slack when we actually want to get things started.
Okay.
So I just need to get my screen share set up properly.
Hey, Jesse, at the top during the intro, are you expecting him to make remarks or are you just going to introduce him?
I'm just going to introduce him.
Awesome, thanks.
Okay. So we are sharing screen. I'm turning my video off. I haven't turned it on yet. Okay. All right. I'm going to mute and then we will go live pretty much. Okay. Jesse, I'm going to count you in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, and then I'm going to mute and hit start on the webinar. Sound good?
Yeah, and then we'll just talk on Slack once Crow's on and to actually start.
Yeah.
Okay.
And if you don't want to start right away, we'll just leave the graphic up. Okay. Until we actually get started. We'll just communicate on Slack from here on out. Sound good?
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. All right. I'm in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us for another Colorado Sun political event. I'm Jesse Paul, a political editor and reporter here at the Colorado Sun and the author of the unaffiliated newsletter, a twice-weekly newsletter peeling back the curtain on Colorado politics. If you're not already a Colorado Sun Newsletters Plus member, please sign up today to get the next edition of the unaffiliated, which we're working on for tomorrow morning. So lots of good news that'll be filling there. We'll go ahead and drop a link to that in the chat, and hopefully you sign up and get kind of peel back the curtain and see what all our notebooks emptied for you. It's because of our members that we can really do events like this one tonight. And joining the Sun is really quick and easy at coloradosun.com/join. Membership starts just $5 a month, and they make all the journalism possible that you see on our website every single day. We really hope that you'll join us and become a part of our community and contribute to our ability to bring you in-depth journalism and, again, events like this. We are waiting for Congressman Crow to sign on. He should be here any second, but I will go ahead and give him a little bit of an introduction. Probably folks already know him. He might even be their congressman, but he is a Democrat from Centennial, Colorado. He was elected to his first term back in 2018 after unseating longtime Republican U.S. Representative Mike Coffman, who's now the mayor of Aurora. Crow was an impeachment manager back in 2020 when former President Donald Trump was charged with abusing the powers of the presidency for allegedly soliciting the interference of Ukraine in the 2020 U.S. presidential election in exchange for military aid. Crow has a really good insight into what's going on in Ukraine right now, given that he's a member of both the House Armed Services and Intelligence Committees. He's a combat veteran, and he served as an Army Ranger in Iraq and Afghanistan. He was actually awarded the Bronze Star for his actions in the 2003 Battle of Samawa in Iraq. We are still waiting for the congressman to log on, but I want to remind folks that you can join this evening, or you can ask questions this evening by emailing them to questions@coloradosun.com. We've already got a ton of questions that have rolled in, and these always kind of help us drive the conversation. And while we're waiting, I just want to remind folks too that we've hosted several events like this already this year. We had the one with U.S. Senator John Hickenlooper. We also had an event with Governor Jared Polis and a bunch of state lawmakers. And so, we brought you folks from all kinds of different places, from different political spectrums, from all over the state, and different topics. So we're really excited to bring you this event. Still waiting on Congressman Crow, but he should be here any minute. So we will get him on here just as soon as he logs on. And just a reminder again, questions, you can submit them tonight at questions@coloradosun.com. Those are super helpful. I know the congressman's excited to hear your questions and certainly answer them. So just while we're waiting on Congressman Crow to join here, some of the latest on the Ukraine situation for those who are probably glued to their television screens like I am. The Russian invasion has entered kind of a new phase, like a siege phase. Actually, was able to talk to Congressman Crow yesterday about what's been going on, and he's basically essentially said that this next phase will be a pretty extreme one, and that he expects the tactics of the Russian military to kind of ramp up and become even more extreme. The Russian military has started to take parts of southern Ukraine, and I know they've taken over at least one town. And certainly there's been some really horrific images that have been on Twitter, videos just of bombings in residential neighborhoods. But it seems like, from everything I've seen at least, I'm hoping Congressman Crook can give us some more insight into this, that the Ukrainian military and citizens have been able to hold off things thus far. All right, I know the congressman now is trying to get on. now we're having, of course, Zoom technical difficulties. So let me help him here. So just a reminder too, that we host these events really regularly and we like to kind of cater them to what everybody needs. So folks who have ideas about different events that they'd like to see the Colorado Sun host, you can always send them to us at newsroom@coloradosun.com. I know the Colorado Sun's trying to beef up its events throughout the year and offer all kinds of stuff. I know we've got one that's being planned on transportation, and we previously had one on healthcare. And these are great kind of conversation starters and ways to, get all the information that you need from all of our reporters who cover all kinds of different tactics. All right. He's trying to log on, but we are having technical difficulties, so. Bear with us.
Hi, Jesse. All right, success.
Hey, Congressman, you're making me nervous there. I can only vamp for so long, so I appreciate.
Yeah, I'm. you can only filibuster. You got to work on your filibuster, Jesse.
I know. I've witnessed a lot of them, but I haven't had to.
Different when you're in the driver's seat.
Yes, I have a new respect for the filibuster. Well, thank you so much. I appreciate you joining, and sorry to our viewers. I know, obviously, we've all lived in the Zoom world, so we kind of know what this is like. So, Congressman, I've kind of given our readers and our viewers here tonight, a brief description of kind of your background, your service in the military, your deployment to Iraq and Afghanistan. I didn't mention, I know that we had talked previously about, how you had visited Ukraine just late last year, weeks before this all happened. So if you're good with it, let's kind of jump in. I'd love to just start picking your brain about what's going on.
Yeah, let's do it. And I apologize, everyone. The logistics got the best of us, but better late than never. So look forward to the discussion. And thank you to the Colorado Sun and to you, Jesse, for putting this together. I look forward to the conversation.
So why don't we just start, about just going to give folks a sense of the information that you have. You're a member of the House Armed Services and House Intelligence Committees. That gives you special access to information that we, the public, can't get. And I'll remind folks too, obviously you're privy to classified information. We respect that you can't share that, but can you give us an idea about how frequently you're getting updates on what's going on in Ukraine and maybe a sense of just what that information is?
Yeah, absolutely. So as you mentioned, I do sit on the House Armed Services Committee and the House Intelligence Committee, otherwise called the House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence, which is a very small committee that's appointed by the Speaker. And I'm actually one of the few members of Congress. There's only a handful of us who serve on both of those. So I'm able to kind of see this from both the military side and the intelligence side. And between both of those committees, we do oversee the full kind of menu of national security operations, covert operations, intelligence, the intelligence enterprise, as well as all the military operations as well. And we do get regular briefings. So I think I received 4 briefings this week, in addition to time that I go in to what's called the SCIF. So in the Capitol, in the basement of the Capitol, there's something called the SCIF, and it's an acronym that stands for Special Compartmented Information Facility, where they allow top secret compartmented, what's called compartmented information, kind of the highest level classification, to be shared and to be briefed. So regularly in any given week, I'll go in there several times a week to get briefed on those programs, because it's very important. The Intel Committee has a very important role, that we serve as the proxies for all of Congress. So we actually receive information as members of this committee that even other members of Congress don't receive. We are kind of deemed the proxies for the Congress to oversee some of these most sensitive programs for our national security. We have to do that fairly regularly as things move and evolve. So I've been on that committee, the Intel Committee, for about a year now, and it's actually very important to Colorado, because we actually have a fairly significant amount of intelligence community assets in Colorado, but also in my district at Buckley Air Force Base, which is a very large intelligence fusion center, one of the largest in the world. And I can't go into obviously all the things that happen there, but a very significant amount of activity and thousands of Coloradans that work within this field.
Okay, so obviously you know probably more than what we do in terms of what's going on in Ukraine right now. You know, I was trying to give our readers kind of an update on what we know that's happening. I'm reading the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the BBC to kind of get my news. But I don't know if you have any updates today beyond what we know in terms of, you know, Russia making an advance in the south, taking maybe one city, starting to target more civilian areas. Any other updates or things that you think are important for our viewers to know just within the last 12, 24 hours?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, there have been a number of surprises to this Russian invasion, this Russian aggression. The first surprise is the underperformance, the poor performance of the Russian military, which has seen halting advances. They're having a hard time refueling their units, feeding their troops, very poor morale. What appears to be the case is that most of their soldiers did not know they were going to be involved in combat and invasion. They were actually told that they were going on training exercises, and the next thing they know, they're invading a country and fighting with Ukrainians. So very significant problems on the Russian side. But Vladimir Putin doesn't really care about that. He doesn't care how many Russian soldiers die or Ukrainians for that matter. He's just willing to continue to throw combat power at the problem. The other interesting surprise has been the overperformance or the incredible will and ferocity of Ukrainian resistance in the Ukrainian military, which has performed extremely well. President Zelensky has really stepped up and shown himself to be an incredible wartime leader and somebody who's rallying the support not just of Ukrainians, but of the world overall. Then the third surprise has been the international response, which has been swift in condemning Russia and coming together to impose sanctions, the likes of which we have never seen in the history of sanctions. The depth and the breadth of those sanctions are cutting and are very significant. So today, the Russian advance continues. It's continuing in the south, and you're right that there are cities that have been surrounded and taken for the first time, very large cities. Mariupol is close to falling, is my understanding, in the south. And the Russian advance in the north on Kyiv has been somewhat stalled, but will continue in probably the days ahead. So really, what is important at this point is number one, making sure we're getting the supplies, the equipment, the resources, the weapons into the Ukrainians' hands and into the hands of the resistance to continue that fight. Number two, today, Russia and Ukraine did come to an agreement on a humanitarian corridor to allow evacuation and refugees and civilians to flee the fighting in the cities. That was a notable development. And then number three, we saw also a couple of European countries apply for membership into the European Union, which is just further evidence that the Russian invasion and Russian war is actually driving European countries closer to NATO and closer to the EU and further west, rather than dividing that alliance like Putin expected this to do.
So I'm kind of interested in your perspective here as somebody who has military experience. We've heard so much talk, obviously, about how, Ukrainians are outmatched with the Russian military, but I'm personally not privy to what exactly that means. Is it just manpower? Is it that the Russians have better equipment or better technology? Obviously, we know that Ukraine's been getting a lot of support from the U.S. and the European Union. Why is this considered such a lopsided fight?
Yeah, well, what we're seeing is the difference between an army on paper versus an army that fights and operates in the field. But you just look at on paper, the Russian military is significantly larger. It's really the second largest military in the world behind the United States, just in terms of the number of troops, the number of tanks, the number of fighters. Russia organizes themselves by what's called BTGs, battalion tactical groups. So that's their kind of level of organization, which is very kind of in between a battalion and a brigade with how the United States organizes. So roughly between 1,500 to 3,000 soldiers, depending upon the type of BTG. So they have over 100 BTGs, about 200,000 troops that they have amassed. About 80% of that has now been allocated into the fight as it has crossed the border and is invading at this point. So yes, on paper, Russia has a much larger advantage quantitatively, a much larger. Qualitatively, the types of equipment is much more modern. They have, what we call tier one weaponry and equipment, things that in some instances is the equivalent to what the United States or a NATO country would have. You contrast that with the Ukrainian military, which overall is about 200,000. So on paper, there's a mismatch. But the Ukrainians are fighting for their freedom, they're fighting for their survival, and they're fighting for they're fighting on their home ground, their home turf. They know this area. These are their houses, their neighborhoods. They're fighting for their families. So, I've always said that the odds are stacked against the Ukrainians, but odds don't fight and win wars. People do. And we're seeing that Ukrainians are continuing to push and resist. So that's kind of the mismatch here. But the Russians still have capabilities the Ukrainians do not have in terms of an air force, a navy. They have a naval blockade in the Black Sea and the Sea of Azov, which is the southern border of Ukraine. They have jamming technology. They have space technology. They have long-range missiles. They have artillery systems, surface-to-air missiles, a lot of things that Ukrainians do not have either at all or the quantity or the quality that the Russians do.
Right. I think, I was looking this up the other day, and I might mess up these numbers, but Russia is a nation of 150 million. So people, Ukraine, I think 40. So obviously, just in terms of sheer numbers, they could be overwhelmed. I mentioned to the viewers before you got on that you were in Ukraine late last year. Or I think actually when you got on, I mentioned that. I wonder if you can talk about what you were doing there, where you were at, if you can share that, and what maybe you saw, or if you could see this situation already brewing.
Yeah, well, we really became aware of this challenge, the prospect of an invasion, what we thought was a very high likelihood of this happening, going back to late last year through the Intelligence Committee and the Armed Services Committee. We started to warn Ukraine and warn our allies. We saw this buildup, but there have been buildups before. There was a buildup earlier in 2021 in April and May of 2021 that did not materialize into an invasion. Russia, by the way, I think it's important to say, has already invaded prior to this, Ukraine, right? They invaded in 2014 and took Crimea, which they've occupied since then, as well as in the east, in Donbass, where they worked through Russian separatists, and they've had Russian military and intelligence officers in plain clothes working with those separatists. So this already happened, of course, not anywhere near what we're seeing right now. But this has been a war that the Ukrainians have been fighting since 2014. It's been going on a long time. So we've been paying attention to this for a while and paying attention to Vladimir Putin's ambitions. And I'll touch on that in a minute if we want to talk about, what is he trying to achieve here. But my role was several-fold. As a member of the Intelligence Committee, I led a congressional delegation, a bipartisan congressional delegation. So it was actually me and two Republicans, friends of mine from the committee, that traveled over to visit our intelligence agencies, our intelligence personnel on the ground, visit our American military personnel, our soldiers who are on the ground doing training and doing support, and also visiting with the Ukrainian high-level military and intelligence officials, their special operations forces commanders and others, to see what do they need. Where was their mind at the time? What did they see as the risks? What types of weapons and equipment do they really need to address those risks, and really try to wrap our brain around what the situation was on the ground. So it was very helpful and informative. And I've taken that time that I spent there with that delegation, and I've used that information, that on the ground information, to really help push the right types of equipment in the right places, in the right quantities, to the right people. And I've been working hard to help make that happen.
Right. I don't know if this is classified, but I certainly had read in the New York Times in preparation for this interview, and just about how something as simple as the Javelin, anti-tank missile launcher, and how that can be easily deployed, and you're seeing all these images of blown out tanks, and that's an American weapon, and it's been super interesting. So obviously, let's jump around a little bit here, because you're talking about Putin's ambitions. I guess that's kind of a question that I think a lot of people have on their mind. Like, what is the end game here? It doesn't seem clear, and what is Putin willing to do to win this war? I'm sitting here wondering if we're going to see a nuclear attack. Is Putin going to move beyond Ukraine into NATO countries? What do you see as kind of the trajectory of this conflict?
Well, we really have to go back to the early days of Vladimir Putin. Who is Vladimir Putin, and how does he see the world? Vladimir Putin is a young man, actually joined the KGB during the Soviet Union because he believed, and he's written about this, some of his public writings, that he believed in that spies and intel officers could change the world. So he actually was a young KGB officer in St. Petersburg when the Soviet Union collapsed. And this is somebody that truly believed in the communist project and the Soviet Union, and his role as a KGB officer, and believed in going back in history in Russian greatness, and that Russia should be one of the, if not the great power in the world. So he was a young KGB officer when the Soviet Union collapsed, and there's this story of him as a young officer sitting over a burn barrel and burning KGB files, and just having a visceral reaction as his dreams and his hopes and his aspirations and his view of Russia kind of collapsed around him. That, many people believe, is really the formative experience of Vladimir Putin. He has since spent his life in the decades since trying to address that collapse and reverse it, rebuild the Soviet bloc and the Soviet kind of sphere of influence in Russian greatness as he sees it. And as part of that, he believes that a bunch of Eastern European countries, Ukraine being the biggest and the most important, belong as part of Russia. He believes that historically it should and must be a part of Russia, that he can't achieve his goal. He can't rebuild that empire without Ukraine. So Ukraine is the crown jewel to Vladimir Putin. And that's why his risk aversion is very low. He has a very high risk tolerance, I guess is a different way of putting it. He's willing to do really illogical and unrational things to try to achieve that. So his goal is to rebuild that Russian empire and to absorb countries and nations that he believes are Russian historically back into that empire, and he's doing that by force.
I think you kind of get a sense of what's going on here. At least for me personally, it makes more sense in maybe a sick, twisted way here that this is all kind of based maybe on pride. The illogical sense of it. It sounds like it is, more Vladimir Putin's ego or something than it is anything else or strategic, which is kind of incredible.
I think that's fair. This is really about the personality and the psychology and the goals of one man. There's no doubt about that.
Yeah. So I know yesterday when we were talking, you had mentioned that Russia is likely to ramp up in terms of siege tactics. I wonder if you could talk about what that means exactly and what that's looking like on the ground. I know we're maybe starting to see that, but how does that physically play out for Ukrainians?
Yeah, so let's just describe to the viewers here what siege tactics is, what that means. So essentially what it means is you surround a city, you cut it off, and you cut off their water, cut off their electricity, you cut off their food supply, you attempt to starve them and break the will of the civilian population and the people. And at the same time, you bombard them with aerial bombardment, with bombers, with artillery, until they cannot withstand anymore and they collapse or they give up, they surrender. That, of course, is a violation of the law of war, violation of the Geneva Convention, and obviously a humanitarian catastrophe, as well as immoral. But it does appear that that's his intent. He's already doing that in multiple cities, Kharkiv, Mariupol, and they look like they're replicating that strategy. So just the magnitude of human suffering and civilian casualties is really hard to grapple with, frankly, and it's going to get much worse if he continues to do this, because it does look like he is not backing down. And as we just talked about his psychology, he must win in his own view, and he's willing to do anything necessary to do that, which makes him an extremely dangerous person. And we're also talking about a nuclear armed, one of the two largest nuclear arsenals in the world. So I think we have to take him seriously. We have to be very careful that we're supporting the Ukrainians, but we're not escalating this and then having it spill into Europe and into a broader conflict as well.
So I know President Joe Biden has said that, American troops will not be on the ground in this conflict, that American planes won't be flying. At least that's my understanding of that. But I wonder if there is a point where you feel like America has a duty to step in. One of the developments that I think people have probably been watching in the past few hours is news that the Russian army was shelling essentially a nuclear power complex, that a fire had broken out there, and that someone in Ukraine, an official, was warning that the disaster could be worse than Chernobyl. Is there a line here at some point where the United States is obligated to move beyond sanctions and providing arms to the Ukrainians to a more aggressive role where, I don't know if there is a point where boots should be on the ground?
Yeah, I don't see that line. For the reasons I just talked about. I mean, there's a lot of things we can do, but and Ukraine is a unmitigated disaster. There's no doubt about that. And all of our hearts are breaking seeing these scenes of civilian casualties and children and bombed daycares. But the reality is, when we're dealing with an unstable man like Vladimir Putin, and a man with a enormous military, but with a nuclear military, whose psychology is a big part of what's happening here. Putting American troops on the ground and fighting against Russians and risking an all-out conventional war between the two great militaries of the world, nuclear armed militaries, it presents a level of risk and potential catastrophic outcome that I think we need to avoid at all costs. And I think that's why I agree with President Biden that we shouldn't be doing this. And I've heard a lot of calls. There's been a lot of people talking about establishing a no-fly zone. But let's just think about what that would entail, right? Well, to establish a no-fly zone, you have to send U.S. fighter jets up into the air, where currently there are Russian fighter jets flying, and they need to shoot down or force down those Russian jets. That's an act of war, and it would create war between the United States and Russia. So for all the reasons I talked about, I don't see that as a tenable solution right now. So there's a lot of things we can do that are short of that, that can help us tip this in a good direction and in the direction of the Ukrainians.
All right, I'm going to ask a few more questions, and then we'll get to some of our reader questions. And again, if you'd like to submit a question, you can do so in the chat, but they are sent directly to me if you email them to questions@coloradosun.com. So, you talked about kind of Vladimir Putin's personality and how that plays into this as you go, trying to fulfill this destiny or whatever that he's going forth. But I guess that begs the question of why now? And I know, obviously in 2014, there was the invasion of Crimea. It's been years since that. the Russian military hasn't changed. What stoked this? And I guess along those lines, I mean, there's been so much talk too about whether or not you can draw kind of a direct line from, the American pullout in Afghanistan to what's happening here. So I wonder if you can address those points.
Yeah. So Vladimir Putin tried to do this without an invasion. He tried to accomplish his goal of reabsorbing Ukraine back into Russia without an invasion. They had a limited invasion, like I said, in Crimea and Donbass. But for the last decade, he's been trying to do misinformation, disinformation, destabilizing operations, and trying to depose the democratically elected leaders of Ukraine, in this instance, Zelensky, or to persuade them to basically become puppets of the Russian state and of Vladimir Putin. He failed at that. So he tried to do it. It didn't work. So that's reason number one. And it became clear that those efforts weren't going to work. The second reason why this is happening right now is because he sees that Ukraine was rapidly moving west, that they were pushing hard for NATO membership, that they were talking about joining the European Union, that they were democratizing, that they were addressing corruption issues and cleaning up their corruption, that they were developing a very strong and healthy civic society, that they were developing a very strong, independent, and free press and media, that all the things that he doesn't like and all the things that are inconsistent and irreconcilable with his form of government and how he rules Russia were developing and speeding up. So for him, he saw a very narrow window, a window closing for him to influence things. And he's moved within that window. So that's why this is happening now.
And I wonder if you can address that other question too, right? I mean, I think you and I have talked about this, but do you think that the way that America left Afghanistan created an opening for this? Was there any kind of influence or direct line? Can you draw connections between the two?
I don't think so. I think that it's more easily explained by kind of the identity crisis that NATO has been undergoing in the last 2 years. So the former president, President Trump, actively attacked NATO, attacked the NATO partners, threatened to withdraw from NATO, to the extent where the NATO alliance itself was questioning its role, its purpose, its very own future. I attended the Munich Security Conference, which is the largest security gathering of NATO and transatlantic allies in 2020. And literally the theme of that conference that year, it was Westlessness. Right? That was the theme of the conference. And the entire idea of the conference was, what are we even doing here? Like, what is our role? What is our purpose? Fast forward 2 years to just a couple of weeks ago when I was there for the conference again. And I've never seen more unity. I've never seen more resolve, more focus on what NATO is about, its role, its value in promoting world stability and prosperity than I saw a couple of weeks ago. So, that's a long way of saying that Vladimir Putin, thought that he saw weakness and he saw an opportunity to take advantage of those fissures in the West and the inconsistencies in the West. And he thought that when he invaded, that those fissures would grow deeper, that it would drive a wedge in the alliance. That was his assumption. He was wrong, because what's happened, as we've seen in the last week, is the opposite has happened. That alliance has drawn closer together. We have more resolve. There are now countries like Sweden and Finland who are not NATO members, who have been not wanting to join NATO, or are now actually talking about joining NATO. You see countries wanting to join the European Union now that weren't doing it before. You see countries like Germany upping defense spending and changing their longstanding policy about providing defensive weapons to partners. So all the things that Putin didn't think would happen are actually happening.
All right, and let me ask one last question before we get to some of the reader questions. The thing that I've been kind of wondering here is what the best outcome we can hope for is out of the peace talks between Ukraine and Russia. From my perspective, as an uneducated, educated but not educated in international relations or warfare, what is the best outcome? What would Russia even agree to, knowing what we do about Putin, knowing what we do about the situation, and Putin being put in a corner essentially?
Yeah, and my personal opinion is I hope I'm wrong here, but my personal opinion is I do not believe Putin will agree to a ceasefire. I believe he thinks that he's already committed, that he's already suffered a lot of the consequences of making that commitment and doing the invasion. That the price of admission for him has already been paid, and that he needs to finish this. And that a ceasefire would be seen as weakness, would be seen as something short of victory. Now, again, I hope I'm wrong, but I think, knowing what I know about him and his goals and what's happening here, I think he continues to push forward on this, and that peace discussions in these meetings are frankly performative or illusory at best. The end game, I think he continues to press this invasion. And I think that eventually this transitions from a army on army fight, or what we would call a conventional warfare, to unconventional, to a resistance movement. And I think that it actually becomes much, much harder for Russia because they don't have a military that's equipped to deal with that. Putin does not have the money for a long-term occupation that's contested. And you have a country the size of Texas with over 40 million fiercely independent, proud Ukrainians who have shown themselves willing to resist and continue to resist. And Russia cannot do that with 200,000 troops. You cannot occupy a country of 40 million of that size with a couple of 100,000 troops. And I think they're about to see that. And I think they're going to be in for a world of pain in the months and years ahead.
All right, thank you for answering that. So now I want to shift to some of the questions that our readers submitted for this evening. I wonder, I'm not going to read out the names of folks who submitted them, but this first one is about whether or not you think that the new sanctions against Russia will be an effective tool to rein in Putin when previous sanctions have not been. What real pain will Putin personally feel with the new sanctions?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the answer is maybe, which I know is a unsatisfying answer, but it's the accurate one. So we have unprecedented sanctions, and that's with respect to the type of sanctions, like sanctioning Russia and Lavrov and individual oligarchs and really his inner circle and those who support him and his control and power. You have broad-based sanctions against their financial institutions, the cutting them off of SWIFT, for example, and the ability of Russian banks to conduct transactions. So these are deep, they're broad, and they're novel. They're things that Russia hasn't seen before, things they're not used to. Now, the factors that will determine whether or not they're successful is, number one, whether we can stick with them. Vladimir Putin doesn't believe that European countries and others will stick with these sanctions for the long run. That as soon as they start having costs and being difficult to maintain, that people will lose interest. That's number one. Number two, he thinks he can continue to work with countries like China and Iran and others and go around the sanctions and continue to sell oil to those countries and keep their revenue going. And number three, he has a very large rainy day fund. So let's not forget that Putin has been planning this for a long, long time. And he's put away hundreds of billions of dollars of assets to help even out the pain on his oligarchs and on the Russian economy for this very reason. So he's trying to outlast us. So the longevity issue, whether we can stick with these sanctions in the long run, is going to determine. Sanctions take a while to hit too, by the way. Some of them are immediate, but most of them take months or sometimes even years to really have full impact. So the longevity is going to be key to success.
It's been kind of interesting to me to see how some of the sanctions have alerted, the Russian people to what's going on. Even something as simple as Apple Pay or Google Pay not working on their phones is kind of a reminder every time you go to the subway or at the store that of kind of the international crisis. So it's interesting to see what the fast acting ones are. Kind of segueing on that, another in terms of sanctions and economic effects, one reader wanted to know that given that oil and gas is the primary driver of Russia's economy, why that economic and banking sanctions haven't specifically targeted the oil and gas industry.
Yeah, well, one of the reasons why is we don't actually, you have to look at the impact, the effect of sanctions and how that will actually help or hurt them. The point is to isolate Russia and to cut off their revenue streams and to hurt them. You don't actually want to do something that will have unintended consequences. And one of the concerns, and I somewhat agree with this and somewhat don't, because I do think we should have sanctions on the oil industry for Russia. But I think we have to be careful on how we do it. We have to target them properly, because if you sanction Russian oil, what happens is you drive up the price of oil, which actually drives up revenue as well, if they still have a place to sell it, and if they're able to go around and sell it to Iran and China. So we want to be careful that we're not actually having an unintended consequences of actually increasing revenue and increasing the global price of oil if we don't target them effectively. So we have to be careful on how we do it. That said, I do think we need to take a hard look and potentially do some manner of oil-based, energy-based sanctions.
That's a very interesting point. I hadn't thought about that. Obviously, the supply and demand aspect, it could backfire there. So this is a question that's been keeping me up at night. I'm glad a reader asked it. How do you think that the U.S. will respond if Russia uses a tactical nuclear weapon? For those who don't know, this isn't like a Hiroshima-style bomb where widespread damage. It's one that would be maybe on the tip of a piece of artillery and be more targeted. And the reader also wanted to know if there's a chance that Russia might use a tactical nuke.
Yeah, I do not know the answer to that. And it's not that I have any special information that I'm not willing to share or can't share. I don't know. I don't think anybody knows. And that's why we have to be careful because they do have, these tactical nukes that are smaller, but they're still nuclear weapons that can wipe out cities and city blocks. And honestly, I hope we're never in that situation. If that happens, I think we would have to gather with the UN and with NATO and figure out the world response. What I don't believe this should be is a US only response. I think we need to continue to lead with our alliances, with our partners. We need to continue to allow them to lead in some instances. One of the remarkable things that the Biden administration has done, they've handled this really well from a diplomatic standpoint, is they've allowed the Europeans to lead on a bunch of things. They've allowed the Europeans to figure out what sanctions are right. And they've actually come to the right conclusion as a result of that. And then they now have buy-in and ownership instead of us trying to tell them what to do. So they really have, in a nuanced and very sophisticated way, in a very diplomatic way, led in some ways, allowed other people to lead in other ways, and keeping that alliance going. And I think there's a huge opportunity for America to reinvigorate those Western alliances and partnerships and to grow them. And I think any response should be based on kind of collaboration and discussion with those partners.
One of our readers wants to know why was the Ukrainian invasion not thwarted by everyone in NATO agreeing to keep them out? Could that have worked as a way to just avoid this conflict?
Yeah, the short answer is not many people believed the United States. We going back to December, started to warn the world, started to warn NATO and even the Ukrainians that this was probably going to happen. And very few people believed us. And in response to that, we actually did something unprecedented. This is another thing that the Biden administration did remarkably well, and in a way that's never been done in the history of our country before. We started to declassify some of our highest level intelligence. We declassified it and we pushed it out to the public. And we pushed it out to our partners and the Ukrainians. And we said this was going to happen. And we said how it was going to happen. And we started to talk about the buildup, releasing specific numbers. And we started to talk about Putin's goals and motivations. And we even released information that we had about a false flag operation that the Russians had planned and were getting ready to implement. And we released that and declassified it. And we deprived Vladimir Putin from the ability to use that. He didn't do it. because we warned everyone that he was going to do it. So that's been pretty remarkable, and the scope and the scale of that declassification. And I think it's worth noting.
So there's been a lot of interesting reporting about China and Russia and the connections, and reporting that the Chinese asked, the Russians to hold off on their invasion until after the Olympics. Are you concerned that China is going to help Russia avoid some of the sanctions? And if they do, should there be any consequences for them?
Yeah, I am concerned about that. I've long been concerned about the close relationship and drawing closer relationship in the alignment of the two largest autocratic regimes between Russia and China. And it's been a delicate relationship, but it's one that has been growing. And I've been concerned about their willingness to buy Russian oil, frankly, and to continue the revenue streams into Russia, and to help soften the blow of those sanctions, and to help Russia usurp those sanctions. And I think that's why we have to continue the diplomacy. We have to continue the declassification to the extent that we can. We have to continue to exert pressure on not just China, but any other country that wants to assist, the rogue regime that is Russia right now. And one thing I'll note, though, yesterday there was a UN resolution condemning the invasion, and it was truly remarkable, the votes in a positive way in voting for that resolution. Overwhelmingly, the world stood against Russia and in favor of democracy and in favor of Ukraine. And even countries that we thought would almost certainly vote no actually abstained from the vote. And that includes Cuba and China. So that was actually notable. But there were some countries that voted no on it that were surprising. And actually, there were a lot of countries in Africa that voted against the resolution, which shows us that we actually have some work to do in Africa, that we have some engagement, we have some diplomacy, we have to have a strategy to address our challenges in Africa, because it's not moving in the direction we want it to move in terms of freedom, democracy, and self-governance.
I do think one of the news alerts that flashed across my phone right before we jumped on was an interesting one from the Wall Street Journal, looking at the relationship between China and Russia and how the invasion has kind of tested that and is testing it. Let me ask you two more questions here before I let you go. I wonder, one of our readers wanted to know if you can talk about the U.S. humanitarian aid that's going to Ukraine right now. Obviously, there's been a lot of talk about ammunition and different arms that we're providing with them, but are we, providing food and water to the Ukrainians as well?
Yeah, the shorter answer is yes, but we also are working on what's called an emergency supplemental in Congress right now, billions of dollars of additional aid. That would be food, water, tents, equipment, and other things to assist. Now, this response will be done by the UN Human Rights Commissioner, High Commissioner, actually UNHCR, UN High Commissioner on Refugees, that will take the lead role here in Europe. But we will support that as a UN member and as a country that does a lot more than anybody else in terms of humanitarian aid and human rights work and aid development. So we've got to pass some additional funding to help backfill the need for what is going to be an unbelievable humanitarian crisis. I think we can expect 4 to 5 million refugees to flee Ukraine into Europe over the next couple of months. And that's going to require an international response to address it.
And this last question, I think, is something that a lot of people are wondering right now. What are the best actionable ways to support Ukraine as an average everyday citizen in Colorado?
Well, I mean, these signs of support, these outward signs of support, the rallies, the protests, actually matter, right? And I know there's some people that say, oh, don't fly the flag or wear the ribbon. What we need is weapons. Well, that's a false choice, actually, right? Because we're working on the weapons and the equipment in that work. But the Ukrainians, and I've actually heard this directly from the Ukrainians, it has meant a lot to them to see the world stand with them. They are in a dark place. They feel alone and isolated in some ways. They're fighting for their survival. They're surrounded by Russians. They're cut off. And for them to open up their phone and then to see protests around the world of people flying the Ukrainian flag and people saying, I stand with Ukraine, from America to every other place in the world, matters to them. It helps with their morale. It helps embolden them. And it shows that they're not alone. So those signs of support do matter. In addition to that, I encourage readers to call their representative and their senator and encourage them to continue supporting Ukraine through these funding bills and to support the supplemental that's going to help with our military response, help with the defensive weapons, and with the humanitarian response. The United States can and should lead and make those investments because it's in our best interest. I think this is something that we haven't talked about yet, but why should this matter to everyday Coloradans? And it matters for a couple of really important reasons. Number one, if we don't stand with the world and if we don't stand up for our morals and our values and for freedom and democracy elsewhere, then we lose our legitimacy as a democracy as well. And I think what we've seen over the last couple of decades is when there's global instability and when there's security problems, we cannot hide from those. That eventually they make our way home. They make their way home and they make their way to us. So it matters when the United States engages, and when we stand for stability and we try to make sure that nascent democracies like Ukraine and others have the ability to fight for themselves as well. The second is just our economic concerns. We have a global economy. It's not a national economy. It's not a state economy. It's a global economy, and even Coloradans know that well. And if there isn't security and stability, then the economy is not healthy, and that means Coloradans can't be healthy, and they can't, do the things they need to do to run their businesses, export their goods, develop new technologies in collaboration with foreign partners and everything else.
Well, we'll be watching closely everything that goes on. I know I probably can speak for all the viewers here tonight that we're going to be glued to our phones and CNN, just watching what happened. It's certainly riveting and extremely upsetting. But I really want to thank you for joining us tonight, Congressman. You certainly helped me at least understand, the situation better and get a better grasp on the what's going on in Ukraine. Thanks again to all of our viewers who signed on. Really appreciate it. Thank you to Eric Lubers at the Colorado Sun for making this possible. And I hope everyone who signed on tonight can become a member, make more events like this possible. Again, you can quickly and easily join at coloradosun.com/join. We'll see you next time for the next event. Thanks again, Congressman. Talk to you soon.
Yeah, thanks.